Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator for today's program. Our topic is, what does education need? Is Senate Bill 191 the answer? Probably no bill considered in the state legislature recently will have as much impact on education as Senate Bill 191, which was passed and signed into law last week. Emotions ran high from many teachers against the bill and equally high from proponents of the bill seeking to reform the way teachers are evaluated. Both groups favor effective teaching, but the argument centers on the best way to improve student achievement. Some say teacher effectiveness is the single most important element contributing to student achievement. Others say there are factors like attendance, parental involvement, and economics that also help determine student success. To help us understand the bill and its implications, we have, on my right, Monty Peterson, retired assistant superintendent. To his right is Mary Dietrich, a high school teacher. To her right is Riley Farrow, Government Affairs Director of the Colorado Children's Campaign. And to her right is Greg Grody, President of the Poudre Education Association. Welcome to you and to our studio and viewing audiences. Riley, as an advocate for the bill, what do you think prompted the bill at this time?
I think there are a number of different factors that prompted this specific bill. I think that we're talking about education reform nationally for the first time in a different way than we have been in the past. And I know for Colorado, there's some staggering numbers that really made this feel like it was the right time. Right now, we have only we're only graduating 3/4 of our students in Colorado from high school. And of those that graduate, over 30% need remediation when they go on to college. We're seeing low CSAP scores, and I think it's time to say, what can we do to make sure that kids in Colorado are getting the best education possible?
Okay, Monty, has this been coming a long time? You've been in education a long while.
Yes, I do. I think it has been coming a long time, and despite current CSAP scores or current issues, for a long time there's been a perception, real or not, that how do you identify effective teachers, and when teachers are not effective, what can you do about it? And the do about it part is a very difficult process right now. And in this bill, that has changed dramatically, and I think that's one of the issues that prompted this to snowball along with the big money at the top.
Okay, Mary?
Well, I think that teachers also are concerned about teacher effectiveness and making sure that the best teachers are in front of our students every minute of every day. However, I think that this bill right now was prompted by the race to the top. I think arms were twisted and said, here's a little bit of money, and go after this money and play the game our way. The Governor's Council was working on teacher effectiveness along with teachers and other groups around the state. And instead of going with the process that was already in place, this bill was introduced in an attempt to hijack the process.
Okay, Greg, what would you like to add?
Well, I would just say that the I believe the main driving force is that Colorado did not get money from the first round of Race to the Top in an attempt to make themselves more better aligned to get that money. There was a desire to make a bill that would appear to make it easier to move teachers in and out of the classroom. And I think it's designed, that's the driving force behind it.
And is Race to the Top really that kind of incentive? I mean, to move teachers out of the classroom? That doesn't make sense to me.
I think there's a piece to make it more fluid, though it's easier to take those ineffective teachers, though we haven't defined what an effective teacher is. And that's what the Governor's Council is designed to do, is to make that clear. This is what an effective teacher looks like, and this is how we can determine. And if a teacher's not an effective teacher, then they want a process that makes it easier to remove them, because at this point, and we'll get into this discussion down the road, you can remove ineffective teachers after you've determined after a certain process. It's something that is in place. It's difficult, but it's in place.
And do we have any idea how many teachers are considered ineffective? 1%, 3%, 10%? Who has any, do you have any figures on that?
Well, I think it goes to the definition of effectiveness. We don't know that yet. So we can't determine how many teachers are effective if we don't know what an effective teacher looks like yet. We can determine how kids score on tests. We have that data, but the correlation between an effective teacher and that student's test score is somewhat muddy, in my judgment.
Okay.
I would
Mary?
agree with that. One of the problems with test scores is that, particularly in Colorado, there is no accountability on the part of the student for the test scores. And I see that particularly in the high school. I teach advanced placement classes, and a couple of weeks ago, I came right out and asked my honors students, who are all excellent 4.0 students, how hard they performed on their last CSAP test. And not one student said they performed at their top level. Most of them said they gave it about a 50% effort. And that's what we're seeing at the high school level anyway, that the test has no accountability. There's no reason for them to perform their best. And so how can you use this kind of testing data to evaluate the effectiveness of the classroom?
Okay, go ahead.
I wanted to respond to that because I think that weighing all of this bill on CSAP would be a problem, but it's put in place in the bill that there are multiple measures that are taken into account for that 50% of the evaluation. But I also anecdotally have heard that students are not trying on their CSAP, and I think it's an assumption that I'm pretty uncomfortable with, because I believe that students are trying. I'm a product of Colorado Public Schools, and I took CSAP, and I tried my hardest, and I don't remember any students taking it not seriously. So I think that there's always going to be examples where you hear different anecdotes, but I believe that children are trying in their schools.
And do we have an idea, because the bill was introduced, what are they looking at? 1%, 3%? We have no idea, really.
We have no idea.
Which I think is a problem. We have no idea how effective our teachers are, and this
Okay.
helps us get there.
A point I'd like to make, if you look across the whole spectrum of all teachers, say, in the state of Colorado, the dismissal rate is very, very low.
1% or less?
If you go to actual termination, it's probably close to that number.
Okay.
What's lost in some of this is that when you have a school district like Poudre School District in Fort Collins, highly regarded school district, attracts quality teachers, hiring processes in place to interview and get those teachers. So the dismissal rate or the ineffective rate in a school district like this would be much different than a larger school district such as DPS or Detroit or wherever you want to have it. So you've got to talk about that in maybe more specific terms, but what this bill does do is it puts it more on a state level than a local level. It's taking some local control away. And the whole thing that Greg said that maybe gets passed over is that there is a process in place now, but what gets lost is it's a very difficult, tedious, almost impossible process to remove an ineffective teacher.
Okay, well, why don't we talk about the provisions of the bill, and then we can see how the bill differs from the practice. I guess mainly we can talk about Poudre R1 because we don't know exactly how it works in Denver or Colorado Springs or Pueblo, but maybe we can have some anecdotal information. What is one of the main portions of the bill, sections of the bill? Riley,
Yes,
go ahead.
absolutely. I think what stands out to me as the biggest piece to this bill is the transition from probationary and non-probationary teachers from the way that it's currently in statute. So the bill looks at evaluating teachers, and if a teacher has 3 consecutive years of effective evaluations, then they are on non-probationary status, essentially what's commonly referred to as tenure. If a teacher has 2 consecutive years of ineffective status, then they're back on probationary status. The bill in no way says they should then be terminated. It leaves that completely up to local control as it currently is in law. So really it just looks at, under the current system, a teacher will teach for 3 years and then will get offered a contract or not. And after that 3 years, if they are offered a contract, they can continue teaching with minimal evaluations, one every 3 years. And as Monty mentioned, it's very, very difficult to remove an ineffective teacher from the classroom.
Okay, so currently, once you have non-probationary status, does it say that you have to be evaluated or observed every year, or you're saying every 3 years?
Well, the way that the current law stands is that if you're a new teacher, you will be evaluated once every year, so an annual
Right.
evaluation for your first 3 years. And you can receive satisfactory evaluations all of the 3 years. And then when it comes time for you to receive your contract, and please step in if I'm incorrect, is if you may not receive a contract, and you may have had satisfactory ratings those 3 years, so you may be a little bit confused, or you may receive your contract and then you will be put on a system where you'll be evaluated once every 3 years. So that changes with this bill.
Okay, and Greg, is that how it works here?
Yes, generally it is. Which is an interesting fact to me, given that the bill asks for 3 years of effective teaching as a probationary teacher. And I did serve 1 year as a principal, and I had 13 third-year teachers under me, and I was looking if they were effective teachers, but the criteria was very much left up to my judgment about if they're effective or not. And that's where I think that's where this bill becomes tricky, and that's where the work of the Governor's Council is key, to look at how do we define what an effective teacher is. I don't mean to keep repeating that, but at this point, I would venture a guess that most principals who are working with probationary staff are watching to see if they're effective at their job, and they're going to get that 4th year probationary continuing contract status or non-probationary continuing contract status based on their effectiveness as it's worked out now, which is a lot of observation. There are some schools that have goals that are tied to student outcomes, so it's not a big shift. The bill's not a big shift with going from probationary status to non-probationary status.
Okay, but the big shift is that 50% is on student outcomes, right?
Right, and we don't know how they're going to judge that, and that's one of the problems of the bill, is that we don't know what they're going to use to determine the student outcomes, and we have about 30%, I think that's the number I've seen, of the tested items for CSAP, reading, writing, math, science. That takes up about 30% of the teachers in the system. That means 70% of the teachers right now don't have a tool to measure their student outcomes.
Okay, Mary?
That's absolutely the major problem at the high school level. Right now we have sophomore CSAPs and 9th grade CSAPs now that we have 9th graders. We have the juniors take the ACT test. It does not correlate at all with the CSAP scores. Our ACT scores are always significantly higher compared to the national average than the CSAP scores. And I'll go back to my point about students putting effort in on CSAPs. I don't think it's there. But the ACT has kind of a built-in accountability for them. It means something to them in order to score well on it. But the real question is, how exactly do you measure student growth? I had a student on her final this week say, "I have now found my voice. I could read 700 pages in 4 hours and feel cool. Now I can read 7 pages in 4 hours and feel more accomplished than ever." There are so many things that a student learns and comes away from school with that cannot be measured on a test. And that's probably one of the biggest concerns at the high school level. I teach a speech class. Kids walk into my speech class never having done anything like that before. So their achievement level is at ground zero. Certainly they all grow in a semester, but is that sufficient? Does that mean I was an effective teacher? Because by the end of the semester, they could get up and talk for a minute? There's a lot more to student growth in a speech class than that, and I'm not sure how you measure it.
Mm-hmm. So you think that probably for each class, some kind of criteria will have to be set up?
Well, and not just the criteria, but also the testing mechanism.
Right.
How are you going to measure someone who takes a speech class?
The 1
You're
minute
gonna do
speech.
a 1 minute speech, but who's going to do that? Am I going to be the one to measure that? Will I do the evaluation at the end of the year? So I'm basically not just evaluating my students, but also evaluating myself? Or is someone else going to come into every one of the 22 speech classes we have at Fort Collins High School and do those evaluations at the beginning of the semester and the end of the semester? And this kind of snowballs into the whole cost factor.
Yes, yes. And what is another provision of the?
I think one of the things that gets lost is that principals are now in this very same boat. They will be evaluated every year, and at least 50% of their evaluation will be on student achievement in their building or their responsibility. Another part of that's very different and is going to cause districts some very interesting process procedures is the whole transfer of teachers. The bill now says that if the school, principal, and teacher representatives don't want a person in their building, they won't have to accept that person, or a person who is tenured or non-probationary has 2 years, 2 school years, 1 calendar year to apply and seek that position, or they're placed on unpaid leave. In the past, non-probationary teachers or probationary teachers were often non-renewed in a reduction in students or a reduction in force, and or a district would place a teacher in a building because the building they were in was losing enrollment and there was a space in another building. And that'll all change. There'll have to be new processes I expect that these folks will be working on to implement, but that's very different and could become very cumbersome.
And that's
Okay.
one of the challenges that comes with the whole philosophy of non-probationary status. When a teacher, say, I don't put myself quite in that same boat because I think most high school teachers have degrees in a subject content area, but an elementary school teacher who's been at, for example, Timnath Elementary for 25 years, all of a sudden finds that their school might be closing. And you have, would you have 30 teachers at Timnath at the moment? And they're all non-probationary. These are teachers who've been teaching from 5 to 30 years, and they may find themselves without jobs under this bill, with no provision that the district, right now our agreement with the district is that they will find a place for them somewhere in a school. These teachers have very few options in the Fort Collins area. Poudre School District, Loveland, Greeley, that's it, to go out and find another job. And makes it very, very difficult, and that's why teaching has long stood strong on this non-probationary status, because it's a job like no other. And it's not like I can go to HP if I'm an elementary school teacher and say, here, hire me. I've been teaching 3 or 5-year-olds for 30 years. It's makes it very challenging.
Riley?
In response to that, there are a few provisions in the bill, one of which is that those non-probationary teachers would have priority when they're looking for jobs in your district and throughout if a school closed or if something like that happened. So they would have hiring, a priority status within the hiring. Secondly, there's a unique piece of this bill that we are the only state now in the country that you can take your non-probationary status and look for jobs in another school district. And so as was current law, this is now law, but before this bill, if you decided that you were in DPS and you wanted to come to Poudre and teach here, then you would have to start over and start fresh, even if you had been teaching for 25 years. And this says that if you're a non-probationary status teacher, you can take that honor with you to a different district if you're so interested. So there are a couple provisions where I see benefits that opportunity it doesn't exist now.
So in other words, the person with 25 years experience in Poudre R1 could go to Loveland if there were an opening and he or she were hired and still come in at the 25-year level?
Absolutely.
And be non-probationary.
And be
Continuing
non-probationary.
contracting, so
Yes.
Okay.
they have due process protections.
Yes. Okay. So in some sense, that's an advantage.
That is an advantage, but you also have to look at the logic of it. Is Loveland going to be interested in hiring a teacher on the salary schedule?
Yes.
At that level?
Sure, I understand that. Are there any questions in our audience? We have a few people. Any Anybody on any of the provisions so far? Okay, then we'll continue, and go ahead.
My name is Susan Farrow, and I'm a pediatrician in Denver. And I work for a group there that has 860 physicians and 5,000 staff who support us. About probably 4,000 some of those staff are unionized workers. And all of us receive annual evaluations from our executive directors on down to our newest hires. So I'm curious from the group if the concept of evaluation itself is in question or in dispute, or more the way that the evaluation is happening. Because my question comes from the fact that I'm used to evaluations. I'm a professional, but I'm still used to having this, and I've seen physicians in our group with many years of experience have their evaluations over a course of time show that they lead to their termination. So this is on a physician level, and it also exists within our union staff. It's not frequent. So with that as my experience in the profession in healthcare, I would like the teachers to address whether they feel that evaluations themselves are a problem, or just the way that they're being prescribed in this bill.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say that I think it's a little bit of both. It has to do with how they're being evaluated, using the criteria of an effective teacher. We don't know what that is. Do you have a definition of what an effective physician is before you start evaluating? How you determine if a physician is effective or not? That piece is missing, and so we're not sure how to judge an effective teacher. Currently, and this has been very recent because of my role as the president of the association, is that principals around the district have trouble with the amount of evaluations they have to do now. They aren't getting done. I have 2 or 3 teachers who are having to meet with their principal tomorrow, and they're not on contract tomorrow, but they have to meet with their principal because the principal hasn't had time to finish the evaluations. And when I was principal, I did most of my evaluative write-up during my spring break. I took that whole week to write up the evaluations for my staff, and I had about 12 staff that I did on a less intensive basis. So there's an issue about finding time to do these effectively, and then having the staff development available so that the teachers have the support that they need to improve. That part's somewhat missing as well. There's a lot of pieces to this. I don't think teachers are at all averse to, the ones that I talk to and represent, aren't averse to having an evaluation that is effective and helps them to grow. There is a lot of issues with resources available to do that. Like I say, the how it's done is just somewhat problematic given the time that they have to do it.
Okay, Mary?
Excuse me.
I welcome having administrators in my classroom. I find it intriguing and stimulating. Most good evaluations take place after there's been an initial conversation about what's going on in the classroom, what has been going on in the classroom, what would the teacher like to see reviewed, everything from, do I call on kids equally? Am I calling on boys more frequently than girls? How is my questioning technique? How involved are the students? All those kinds of questions with a good evaluation take place before the intervention in the classroom. We have over 140 teachers at Fort Collins High School. This year we've had 1 administrator assigned solely to do teacher evaluations. Every teacher in the building was evaluated this year. Non-probationary teachers were evaluated once. Probationary teachers were reviewed 3 times. It's a very thorough process. Can I say every evaluation I've gotten over my 17 years in the school district has been good? No, it hasn't been. In fact, at the school board meeting last month, I stood in front of everybody and said, I received non-probationary status without ever having been evaluated. The first 3 years I was in this district, no administrator was ever in my classroom. And I found that appalling. And I asked several times, can somebody please come see what I'm doing? I had come from CSU, and I don't know why. I never did get an answer why. So I don't find that acceptable either. And evaluations are an important part of the teaching of the experience.
Monty?
A couple of points I would make. I think it's a paradigm shift, and the paradigm shift is this. There's a discomfort about defining an effective teacher, and there's plenty of research, so that'll get done, and that's easy. There's discomfort about student assessment and that being a part of it. That would be akin to me saying to you, if one of your patients didn't get well or died, you're ineffective. And so that student progress, how much, what kind, the degree of, is a little bit frightening, but there's also good research that I believe will define that adequately. What maybe really gets to the core of it is that there's a certain amount of independence in any teacher's classroom. And this forces probably a very consistent curriculum, a very consistent set of standards, a consistent set of knowledge-based things that need to be taught and will be evaluated. And that puts you kind of in a box, or more of a box, and there's a comfort level that is now or has been in the past. It used to be, if I was an AP teacher, I knew what that AP test at the end was going to be, and I could teach to that. But that's not true for a lot of other teachers. So there's unknowns, and therefore there's discomfort.
Yes, go ahead, Riley.
Well, I had 2 points to go off of this, and I think the example that Mary gave is frighteningly common, that a teacher has earned non-probationary status and has never been evaluated, or has received a written evaluation but never saw an administrator in their classroom. And this bill really looks at putting some structures in place so that doesn't happen. And it sounds like you're in a system now where there is great support, and that's incredibly helpful. And I would assume that if you were not as an experienced teacher, that would just double on top of itself and become even more critical to how well of a teacher you could become. And so I know that all of the intentions behind this bill, and there are many fears, but is that it wants to be a support system for teachers and principals, all educators, to make sure that we're evaluating them effectively and giving them the support necessary to make them excellent professionals. And Monty's example of shifting this to a healthcare example of if a patient died, you would be ineffective. I would shift that and say, my example would be that if a patient came to you and they were sick, and you went through the process and got them well by doing analysis on what was the problem that was going on, and then treating it and giving medication. And it's that process, and that's what this bill is really focused on. It's not on academic achievement, and that's why I really like it. It's on academic growth. And so you're seeing these students come in, and they're showing that they're learning and they're growing. And I think that Colorado's lucky to have so many teachers that are effective and doing a great job at that, but we have no way of knowing consistently what that looks like right now.
It's a very challenging topic because every class has a different set of criteria. And to carry the healthcare analogy further, if a doctor gives a recommendation to a patient that, well, you better start getting some exercise and you better lose some weight or you're going to have a heart attack, and the patient has a heart attack 6 months later because he didn't follow the physician's advice, is the physician responsible for that? You know, I teach speech classes, and this semester I have several young students who are not passing my class and did not meet much in the way of academic growth. Is that because they said no thank you when it was time for them to give a speech? Or is it because of my failure as a teacher? You know, some of that comes down to motivation, and I try my best. But when I look at them and say, did you do the outline you were supposed to do last night at home? And they go, no. Whose responsibility is that? So I think one of the biggest concerns for teachers, and I can't stress that enough, is that in some way the process as it goes through has to take into account the student responsibility.
And I want to carry the analogy further. Analogies are so much fun, but
as an English teacher, I agree.
if you are in the physician world, and you get your success is dependent on your survival of your patients, or the growth of your patients, or health of your patients, are those doctors going to be willing to work with the terminally ill patients that have no hope? Are they going to be willing to take that risk if they know that they could lose their job if those patients don't survive? It's similar to if we have students who typically have difficulty with with the growth. The students who have English language as a second language, those students typically don't show the same kind of growth. And if teachers are going to lose their job because their students don't grow, are they going to be willing to take on these challenging jobs that really need the very best teachers? And I think there needs to be clarity around that. I think there's some adjustments in the bill that I've seen that address that somewhat, but to what degree? And if we want the very best teachers, in fact, we have a discussion here in Fort Collins at Poudre School District about creating a system where we try to put the best teachers in the schools that have the highest need. And I'm thinking, if I'm a teacher, and I've talked to teachers who have this point of view, that if I could lose my job because my students don't test well, then I'm going to be disinclined to go and work with those students. And even if there's incentive to pay me $5,000 more a year because I can go to those schools, but then the schools, those students don't make adequate growth, and we haven't defined that yet.
Yes.
Then that portion is problematic.
Right.
And so I
Did
see
you want to
nodding.
say something,
Yes.
Riley?
I know, jump right in.
She
yes.
looks like she's ready.
She does. She's ready.
Well, I want to remind that it's 50% of the evaluation that's based off of student growth. It's not 51%, it's 50%. And so that doesn't determine whether you're effective or ineffective. It's a major factor. And secondly, I know that there is the notion of at-risk kids, and this was brought up and is a very sensitive issue, and it was brought up on the House floor and a number of different places when the bill was being debated. And you see time and again, an example after example of those kids doing an excellent job and showing growth. And if you are a 9th grade math teacher and you're teaching at a school with a high number of English as a second language students, or something that a teacher would find more challenging, they have that much more room for growth if they're at a 5th grade math level when they come in. And it's not saying that at the end of the school year they need to be at a 10th grade math level. It's just that they have to have shown growth in that academic year. And so I think the potential for growth is even greater in those situations.
Okay, let's talk about teacher effectiveness, because we've skirted that issue. Who would like to take a stab at what an effective teacher is? Should you do that first, Greg?
Why not? That's an easy one. Sure.
Okay.
There are a lot of, I did an activity with a group of teachers this year, 40 teachers, and I asked them to make a list of traits. I did not bring it with me. A list of traits for what an effective teacher is, a teacher that motivates students, that creates this love of learning, that manages the classrooms well, that is able to communicate with parents, is able to understand individual needs, is able to deal with emotional issues that come into the classroom and manage all of that, work with colleagues, work with administrators. It's a very complicated process, I believe, and those are just the traits that we're not using, we're not measuring those by a student by a test score of any kind. So then, and I'm part of an advisory group that's working with the Governor's Council, and we have hours of discussion about what goes into being an effective educator, and it's just a very complicated process, and a lot of details and a lot of factors that play into that.
Okay, Mary, as a teacher, what do you think?
I think the best teachers take chances. I think they put their job on the line every day to try to poke a kid, encourage a kid, try a different approach, break out of the boxes that I want my kids to break out of. But what that teacher looks like is completely different. Before the session tonight, we were talking about a long-term teacher at Fort Collins High School who was kind of my mentor when I started there 17 years ago. And I said, boy, I just want to be just like her. Well, that wasn't my teaching style. Mm-hmm. And I know that there are teachers in my building who are amazing, and the kids admire them, and yet their classroom looks completely different than mine. And I'm okay with that. Now, one of the challenges for administrators, and this is one of the other questions that constantly comes up, is are the administrators experienced enough and trained enough to recognize all of the different ways that a teacher can be effective? Because an effective teacher has probably 1,000 different faces.
Okay, Monty, as an administrator, how did you do that?
Well, it's really fun. To go into a kindergarten room and see a loving, caring, motherly personality, and you transfer that personality to a middle level school where they're a little hyper, doesn't work. And so you see, as Mary indicated, the different styles and the different processes. And I see that written into the bill. When you talked about a student that wrote to you and said, I can do this better. That might be a criteria that shows growth as you develop it. It doesn't have to be an examination or a written documented. It might be Mary's observation that this student has grown in my speech class, and how she documents that might be effective enough.
I think
but
it could also be the student's evaluation.
Sure, of themselves, absolutely. You know that there are a handful of things as administrator when you go into a classroom. Classroom management, do they love kids? You know, is there the kinds of things that they need to have for their subject matter in terms of methodology and content? Those are rudimentary things that you know need to be there. But then you begin to look for the stuff between that kind of glues the whole thing together. And it's a fun thing to do. I love doing it as administrator. And Greg, I know your time is, you know it when you see it, and it's fun to watch a master teacher at work.
That's a tricky thing to say you know it when you see it, though, for trying to define it in law.
Yep.
Can't just say I know it when I see it
That's
as a legal term. That's the difficulty, I think, with the bill right now, and that's what the work of the council is designed to do. And then part of the objection from our point of view, when I say the teacher association, is that the council, if they had come up with their definition, and then we had gone back to say, okay, how are we then going to use that information to create an evaluation system that perhaps looked at continuing contract status or non-probationary status, that would have made more sense to us, rather than do this first and then down the line create this definition of what effective would look like, rather than just, because I get the same thing, and I know teachers who say they know who the good teachers are in their building, and I say, how do you know? You don't even see those teachers. You just have this perception. A lot of it's perceptual, and it's difficult to have a perceptual understanding drive a very high-stakes bill.
I believe that a framework can be developed, and the subjectivity of that can be a part of that framework. And I don't think my advice to you would be jump in and work with it, because I think it'll pay dividends in the long run.
Oh, we definitely are going to jump in and work with it. We're going to work very hard with it. One of the other challenges that we constantly face, though, is that when you have an administrator, and I know a teacher in an elementary school who has a very, exuberant, kind of crazy classroom, and her kids are doing fine on CSAP scores and everything else, and yet every time she's evaluated, the principal says, your class needs to be more organized. And so we have that dilemma also. I personally have had that dilemma in my classroom where, I'm kind of crazy at times, and one administrator came in and said, I'm not sure where you were going with this. And I said, oh, but my kids did. And you walk into my classroom for 50 minutes without knowing the context, and
Sure.
it becomes very challenging on both sides.
And
And that's why I'm glad to see the conditions in here that say, if you receive an unfavorable evaluation, there are some steps in which you can challenge it, because that wasn't in the original bill.
Right.
That's a whole long way from an unfavorable evaluation. That's fruit for a beautiful discussion between you and the administrator, talking about how you're approaching your kids in that particular lesson. That is miles away from termination or poor evaluation. That is one observation that gives you the professional interchange to say, here's what we're trying to do, here's why we're trying to do it, for you to learn maybe a priority or a concern from an administrator, and for then you to help that administrator understand what this group of kids or what this subject matter or what this particular chemistry of this class needs. And I see that as a professional dialogue that helps both in the give and take.
Yes,
So I would hope that would be the scenario that would.
Well, I have not had that problem with it, but I do know that other teachers have.
Okay, I think we have a question in the audience.
My name's Nancy Crow, and I'm from Fort Collins. And my question is my understanding that the other professions, in the law profession and the physicians, police their own. So doctors are evaluating doctors, lawyers are evaluating or policing them and making sure that they are doing their job. And I guess my question is to Greg and Mary. maybe I should preface this too, that I have spent 25 years in the classroom. I also am a licensed K through 12 principal, and I think that my experience as a teacher would help me evaluate my fellow teachers much more than my training as an administrator. And my question is to Mary and Greg, has the teaching profession made an effort to police their own? Yeah, I think Mary maybe talked about that. You were thinking about making some of those efforts because, in my opinion, teachers probably do a better job evaluating teachers than anyone else could.
I think that that has some merit. One of the problems with that process and with many of the provisions of the bill tie into the current economic crisis in Colorado. Teacher workload is unbelievably high right now. Our average teachers spend 60 to 70 hours a week doing their jobs, and to then release them from their own classrooms to go into other classrooms to observe becomes very time consuming, and also takes them out of their own classroom, which is where they should be. So teaching is a little bit different than some other professions in that regard. We certainly do have exchanges within my department where someone will say, you know, I'm going to take a day off. In fact, a teacher did that last year. She took a personal day and said she just wanted to go around and observe other teachers for her own benefit because she wanted to see what was going on in the building. But I think it does have some merit. I think, unfortunately, if the bill turns into, if the provisions of the bill about effective teaching make it a competitive me against you kind of scenario where, excuse me, my kids score a little bit higher on this test than yours do, and I'm not going to give you a good evaluation because I want to help my position in the school, that could get very dangerous. It wouldn't help kids at all.
And next week there's a committee that's meeting that's looking at how we do teacher evaluations in our district, and we're looking at redoing our system, and that's part of the discussion, is doing peer evaluations. I think to Mary's point that the time issue, finding time for those teachers to be able to leave their classroom to be part of that is somewhat challenging. There's also another issue around the evaluation versus staff development, because teachers can help each other grow by becoming better, but there's a judgment piece in evaluation that if you're working with your fellow workers and you have to create that collaborative process, if you're making judgments and passing judgments about how they're doing it, are you going to be willing to work side by side if you know this person's made a judgment in a negative way? And if you're honest, you might need to say it's negative. That's where the separation for principals is somewhat helpful, because they can say, yes, in my judgment, you're not effective here, and you don't have to work with me. I'm your boss, as opposed to a peer who you need to work with. And if you want to be effective for the kids, and we haven't talked much about that, by the way, and that's an interesting piece to me, that we're all about the students. But if I'm supposed to work collaboratively with a coworker to help my students grow, and that coworker has made judgments about my abilities, I'm less likely, I think that's a fair judgment, a fair step to take. I'm less likely to work with that person. So there's nuances to that peer evaluation that we have to be very careful about.
What about the idea of master teachers evaluating? And I don't know if they would have to come out of the building or how that would work, or... Again, I would love to be part of that process. I would love to have the time to walk around the building. And one day last fall, I happened to, during one of my off periods, I happened to be walking down the math hall and saw a young lady who was a brand new teacher, and she had been in my class 7 years ago. So I popped my head in and said, can I sit for a minute? And it was amazing to me to watch this young woman work with a group of at-risk kids and trying to teach them some basic math skills. And since then, I've popped in on her classroom a couple of times. But again, it's a matter of time. Sure.
You know, I refuse to take the time away from my students when I don't have to. And
Riley?
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything in the bill that would encourage a teacher to leave their own classroom to do an evaluation at any point in time. But it does leave the evaluation piece open, so it can be peer-to-peer evaluations. It can be any level of administrator to the teacher, or you can work it out within your school district for what fits best for the community that you're serving. But I think what both of you touched on, it sounds like there's a fear that there would be an adversarial role between teachers, where every bit of research we have and kind of just what you inherently believe, or most people, is that a holistic education is going to be a better education. So to be constructive in a negative way isn't going to serve your students in a good way. You want your math teacher as well as your arts teacher to be helping each other in career development. And I think that anytime there's the word evaluation or kind of this judgment or fear comes along with it, but I know that I've learned more from my coworkers than and their constructive criticism, and it helps me grow. And I've never taken it, and it's circumstantial, but I think it can be very positive too.
Okay, I think we have another question in our audience.
Well, this is another question just for the group. I know that this bill has already been made into law. It's already effective. But as a voter and a parent, when I heard about this, my interpretation was that this bill is not to put the vast majority of good teachers, satisfactory teachers, in jeopardy. It's really a way to be able to identify the really poor performers. Is that the way that you all are interpreting this, and that in operationalizing it, you think that it will be used?
Okay, Monty?
I would concur with your statement in general. Yes, I think that a major portion of it will help define a better process for helping the ineffective teacher. And that's something that is very cumbersome right now. And if I might, I'll just take a minute and go back to the lady's question. I hired lots and lots of principals over the years and hired lots and lots of teachers, and I think you're right on. The people that I worked with in the hiring committees wanted to have input into the hiring, but when things went south, it was always the singular administrator that was the person that had to call the shot. And I would encourage Greg and Mary to help devise whatever budgetarily will work to get your master teachers involved in helping those that need the help. And I know that Poudre School District does have means and mechanisms to do that, but the means are wholly short.
The means are very short. And that's the scary part for us, really, when you consider, as Greg said, that 70% of the classes taught in this school district do not have any kind of a guideline about what student growth is, how it's defined. That's going to be quite a cost to the local school district to develop all of those guidelines and to put them in place and to decide how those evaluations are going to take place. We don't have enough money now to pay good teachers. We're losing good teachers now because the salary schedules are so low and because our per pupil expenditures are so low. And I think that's a real problem that this bill does not address.
Greg, anybody?
I think the question is very good. And Monty, I appreciate that you keep encouraging us to be part of the process, and we will be. And that's part of this district's. You were there for a long time. This is part of how we do business. We work together to kind of make the best of what we can do. And I've thought about this in terms of worst fears and best hopes. And I'll be honest with you, many teachers I represent, they go to worst fears about this. They see this as a very scary, very punitive type of bill where they're going to lose their ability to be innovative because they're going to have to really teach to a test that we don't know what the test would be yet, but they're going to teach to that test because their job security is on the line with making sure their students grow, and they're going to not be innovative, and they're going to be restrictive to how they do things. And that's a worst fear that we have. A best hope is that we can make this work to create that kind of atmosphere where we create that collaborative growth. We don't know how it will be, and my goal as president of the Teacher Association is to find a way to move towards best hopes while being very aware that the stakes are high for principals as well. Right. And one of my one of my worst fears is that we become similar to Aurora, Jefferson County, and Denver, where they, and I've talked to a number of teachers in those areas where, because the stakes are high for those school districts, that they are very constricted. The principal says you will teach this lesson, all fourth grade will teach this lesson this day at this time to your kids because we want test scores to grow. And I would be very fearful if that's the case in this district, where we lose the collaborative process. And it could be where we work together, where principals where there's high stakes, they start to work with their teachers where there are high stakes, and they work together. I see another scenario where principals who now part of their evaluation is based on student test scores at a higher degree than it has been before, and they don't have control. They're further away from the students, and they have to take steps to ensure that the students are doing what they believe is correct, and they become more top-down as far as, you're going to do this because I'm afraid for losing my job. Those are all possibilities. It's going to take a deft touch to manage this, I believe, and so I'm on your side with trying to get it done well, but I also recognize that we've got to be cautious with how we look at this with the kids' outcomes in mind. I think that's important. Okay, well now that brings me to this Governor's Council on Educator Effectiveness. Do any of you know anything about that, and will that feed into this? Absolutely, and if I could speak to that, because sure, go ahead. Through my role as the president of this association, I do work on a committee, a task force that advises 3 of the 4 teachers that are on this committee, and their task is to define what an effective educator is, and going through that process of how we do that. So that's, as I understand it, that's the role of it's not the Governor's Council anymore, it's changed its name to the Government Council. It's broadened so that it can't be, so the next governor can't come in and decide they don't want to do it, so it's a more solid group. It's part of the bill now, part of the bill, I think. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Can you talk to that, Riley?
Yeah. So the Educator Effectiveness Council was created through an executive order right at the beginning of the legislative session this year, and much of this bill codifies that into law. So we will inevitably have a different governor in a few months in Colorado, and so this says that the work that they're doing, that's very collaborative. There's people from the teachers union, there's teachers themselves, there's actually a student on it, parents, a whole range of different
principals and superintendents.
Yeah, a range of different folks, so that we can get the people that are in the classrooms, all talking, and then now that it's in law, that can continue on without being interrupted at any point, because say the next governor comes in and has a different idea, and so that stops them from actually getting to the point where they can define what effectiveness is, or make the different recommendations that they're charged with doing. And there's a whole process in place where what comes out of that will then go to the state board, which will then go back to the legislature before things start rolling and you see any changes in a classroom.
So that there are deadlines for all that, I gather.
Yes.
I think I saw that in a newspaper article. So there are certain deadlines that goes to the state board. From the state board, it goes to the legislature.
Yes.
And then it will be implemented in the districts.
In sort of a test
Phased
year.
in.
Oh, that's
Yes,
right.
there will
Yes.
be a pilot program.
Yes.
So we won't actually see full implementation of the bill until 2014, which to the Education Association's credit, really helped change that timeline and make it a much more realistic one and a much more thoughtful process, I think. So,
Yes.
So there was a very collaborative effort on that was wonderful.
Okay, now has Pooter R1 gone through this kind of evaluation or process before? Do we go over these things every once in a while? Do you know, like every 10 years, change the process of evaluation, or?
Do you want to address that, Lonnie?
Yes, it is periodic. It rolls. I can't remember when the last one was, but during my tenure in the school district, we probably did this a half a dozen times. So I'm not surprised that there's a new shot at it, and it will be different.
Okay, so it's not as if this is the first time something like this has ever happened.
No,
Anyone who's been in the business a while knows that this is what goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I think that the potentially new part, and in my judgment, a little problematic, is the attaching it to the due process. 10 years misnaming it, but a due process. And from my point of view, one of the worst fears I have is that what due process does is allows teachers to speak up more safely about their kids, and if we lose that due process, you lose that honest dialogue. I will share that in my year of being president here, I've had, I want to say, 5 or 6 administrators from principals up to higher levels that have come to me to say, would you please carry this message forward because I don't want to lose my job. But they didn't particularly agree with what was happening above them. And to me, if someone's not safe to express their opinion about something that might be beneficial to kids, there's something wrong with that. Okay. And I know that continuing contract protections just allows those teachers to say, you know what, this idea that we have from this think tank that might be best for kids, for my first grade students, isn't working. And I need to tell you, I'm not going to do it because it's not working for my kids. And they're safer to do that. I mean, there's degrees of doing that, how you do that. But that honest dialogue is, to me, it's significant to ensure that that teacher-child relationship is somewhat protected from the political winds that go back and forth in this world that we live in. So that's a concern that I have, and that's a different thing that's coming out of this bill than it's, I think, ever been.
Okay. And I have talked to 2 teachers who disagreed with their administrator on policy positions, and both of them were told, you do not discuss this with other faculty members. If you have an opinion on this matter, you may only talk to me. And that's pretty scary in a school district that has long favored a collaborative process. And under this system, those teachers definitely react as if, well, then I will never say a word. I will stay in my classroom and I will do what I'm told. And if that's what the school district wants, then it's going to lose its edge in innovation and creativity.
And so what's the process there? Riley?
Well, before I get into what the process is, I wanted to say, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but one of the benefits that I see in this bill with the evaluation is that 50% is completely objective. And so that fear that you're going to have a personality conflict or between an evaluator and a teacher, or something that would arbitrarily change your evaluation from effective to ineffective, you have some protection in there. If you're a fantastic teacher, that's going to show. And so that's something that I'm just interested in.
Yeah.
Well, I think that your use of the word objective is really interesting, because all along we've been talking about how the evaluation process has to be open-ended and it has to allow for creativity and differences. And unless it's based solely on test scores, it's going to be very difficult to come up with a 50% evaluation that is objective.
And I think for me, it goes back to the best hopes, worst fears thought. We don't know how some of this, we don't know what the, first, what a definition of effective is yet. We don't know what kinds of assessments they're going to use, given that based right now we have the CSAP, and we have assessments for reading, writing, math, and science. So we've got that narrow scope of what we have. So we don't know, there are pieces that we don't know. So best hope is that we have assessments that fairly measure those topics, if we can do that. And I think that's one of the objectives of trying to work in a collaborative process with the Governor's Council and that that group that includes many, many different kinds of folks in the education system. And then the the issue around conflict between teacher and principal, that's been there. Has been there forever. If you have different personalities involved, and so I would not argue that I think having it divided by some student outcomes and the more subjective types of observations, because that's what we have now, subjective observations, and that's served us fairly well, I think, for the most part, so it's just it's the worst fear is that the assessments are going to be potentially unfair. We're not going to do it in a way that's going to be effective. They just, again, it's best hope, worst fears.
I appreciate hearing you say that it's the age-old boss-employee thing. It's going to happen. Now, that said, the principal evaluation has to be as thorough as the teacher evaluation. So if you have leaders, administrators, principals that are exhibiting that kind of behavior, that has to be dealt with, and that is the responsibility of the supervisor of those principals, and that evaluation process has to be thorough enough so those areas, if they exist, are addressed. Otherwise, it just becomes, well, I can't say this because I'm intimidated. You've got to deal with that straight on, and it can't be can't do it because. That's got to be built into the process. So a teacher can stand up for the rights of their children and what they think is right, or at least have that meaningful dialogue and agree to disagree. But it isn't professional threatening unless it is a bigger part or part of a bigger picture.
The other question that I have is if the Governor's Council says what an effective teacher is, where does the Poudre R1 school district or any individual school district fit into that? Can they have their own standards? Do we know that?
I don't know that we know that. I think
We
that's
don't
part
know
of
that.
the local control issue that is potentially problematic, in that we have a state where there's a history of local control, and that's a very important part of this state. And this bill has potential to take away some of that and become more centrally controlled by the state government based on some of the rules that come down. So I think that's yet to be determined, in my judgment.
Now, I do know that the state of, I think, Delaware, Tennessee, and Illinois have done some of this already. Do we know anything about outcomes? Do any of you know anything about outcomes there?
I read an analysis of, it was an article in the New York Times last week on the whole race to the top game, as they called it. And they specifically talked about that, and that there are no results yet from those states. The only other comment that I could throw in is Diane Ravitch, who worked for the Bush administration and was one of the primary developers of No Child Left Behind, has come out very vocally against a lot of the forms of evaluation that are being put into place, especially in terms of assessment. And her major concern is, and I think that many teachers echo that we are blaming the problems in the educational system, and I don't doubt, only graduating 75% of our kids is not where we want to be, but are teachers and the schools responsible for these numbers in and of themselves? Or are there social and economic issues that come into play when kids don't succeed? I have a student who came here from Ohio, from a very, very bad home situation in Ohio, is living with her brother and struggles every day just to get to school. She has not succeeded this year. Hopefully she'll succeed next year. But, we're constantly faced with these kinds of situations where we have kids in very, very challenging situations. I had a student a couple of years ago who was in and out of jail 5 times over the course of the semester. At what point does the community hold the school district responsible for problems in this community?
Yeah. Riley, you have a comment?
Yeah. Well, I think first there is a provision in the bill that says when we're looking at evaluations, we need to take account for a population of over 95% at-risk students in the classroom, student mobility, a number of different factors that play in, as you just touched on, and there is research that says yes, the home life is the most important factor, but of what we can control at the school, teachers and leaders are the #1 most influential piece that will determine academic success. And so if you don't have a good home life, is that a major challenge? Absolutely. But what we do know is these students are sitting in front of their teachers for 5 hours, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months out of the year. So we're not saying that you have to reach some sort of academic achievement, but we're saying that with that time that you have with these students, you need to be an effective teacher and show growth and impact on these students. And is that too much to ask? Is that not too much to ask? So.
And what are the possibilities for measuring all these different things? If it's not one measurement, if it's not just CSAP, what are the other possibilities?
Do the teachers get to pick their own tests? Because I think that would probably produce growth. There was some discussion about the if each teacher in each district even can create their own assessments to measure, for example, art or PE in some standardized form, it does create this inequity potentially around the state. And if we're wanting a system that, if we're going to carry over effectiveness from one district to another, there needs to be a similar standard from one district to another. It's problematic. It's a very big challenge, and we want to do it well. I think the pushing back the timelines was very helpful to be able to give time for the council to do its work, but there's a very real issue about resources given the state's budgetary situation, and I think about the comment made about student growth and how important family is to this. I also think about if the federal government had funded the IDEA, I think that's the special ed programs, to its, I think we're at 20 cents on the dollar for our district. So I think M.L. Johnson spoke at a school board meeting just recently that if they had funded it the way they were supposed to, our district would have $25 million more to help with students. The amount of that kind of resources, we would see amazing growth. And I think one of the potential problems with this is that we're expecting this bill to fix a problem that's much bigger than this bill is able to fix, much in part due to the resources available to the schools.
Okay.
So
It becomes an issue of centralization, decentralization, local control, local boards, individual teachers in individual classrooms. You take a student and you move them from Durango to Denver to Fort Collins, and they could have all kinds of holes in their learning if there's not a consistency in the state. How are you going to do that statewide? You impose certain standards and certain curricula that teachers have to teach and then will be measured by. And that then does take away a certain amount of individual classroom, district control.
And you do have to measure at the beginning and the end of the year, right?
Pre and
You have
post.
to have a guideline or a baseline. So
You
your
have to-
student who couldn't give a speech at the beginning of the year maybe could give a very good one at the end, and that would be a measure of success.
It would be a measure of success. And good teachers do that. You know, every class I teach has some kind of an assessment at the beginning of the year or the semester and at the end of the year. But I develop those assessments, and I modify them. If I find that the assessment I gave the first day of class didn't work, I'm going to try something else. And does that match the state standards? Does that do what it is supposed to be according to state guidelines? You know, as a teacher who likes to work outside the boundaries, it concerns me that I'm going to have that roster on my door every day that says you will first do this, and then you will do this, and then you will do this. And several years ago, the big push in education was individualized instruction.
Yes.
That was one of the paradigms that was out there then. Before that, we had outcomes-based instruction. And now all of a sudden we have this. I've just been a teacher for 17 years, and I think I've been through 5 different paradigms. And now we have another one. And again, it's basically unfunded.
Okay, Monty.
I have to respond to that, though, Mary. It's not an individualized curriculum. You can't do that. You can't teach your
No,
own
I can't.
curriculum. But sometimes when we get into that, how can you measure then? Can you see the dilemma that we have if you begin to assess students and you have each teacher have their own curriculum? There's no way the assessments can be built for that or should be built for that. Or can we transport students from school to school within a community or from community to community when you have individual teacher curriculums? That can't be. I'm not sure now that we can have school district curriculums. I think the state curriculum or a national curriculum is going to get floated, and that's where you get an assessment tool that will be consistent across the board. I believe you have to go to work hard and say, we're very comfortable that for this class, these are the standards students have to meet. And you have agreement on that.
Oh,
Beyond your
I
classroom.
don't disagree at all that
Okay.
there need to be standards. You know, but I know that if I have 2 different speech classes, and within the standards that I'm expected to meet, I teach those 2 classes completely differently because of the kids who are in it.
But you can't change the standard.
No, I don't change the standards. And my advanced placement class is the same way. Advanced placement sets the skills
Exactly.
that students need to know at the end of the year. And I teach to those skills. But my curriculum looks completely different than the curriculum at Fossil Ridge or the curriculum at Cherry Creek.
But I think that's exactly it, that you're still meeting those standards, regardless of even if you're changing how you meet those standards with from one class to the other.
Well, as long as it's clear that there's a difference between standards and curriculum.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And who's going to set the standards, the state or the district?
The state sets the standards.
The state. Okay, I think we have another question in the audience.
Yes, my name is Carol Rush. I'm from Loveland. This is really an interesting discussion. I've enjoyed every minute of it. My question is, as I understand it, 50% of a teacher's evaluation would be based on how the students perform on the CSAPs or another type of test. Will student progress be judged uniformly for all students? Is there an allowance for students who learn at different rates? Thank you.
Well, I believe that was in the original bill. That has since been changed to simply say that teacher evaluations will be based on student growth. It doesn't specify that it will be CSAP or any other standardized test.
I think the word in the bill, and correct me, is multiple measures of student performance.
Absolutely.
Correct.
And it's cited that CSAP could be used as one of those multiple measures, but so could projects and a number of different things, which has not been defined. And to your question as well, it doesn't say that it will be a certain percentage of growth, nor does it say judging that growth one student against the other. My guess would be that the council would want to do some sort of a classroom average or something that can show overall teacher effectiveness, but that's left very open to the council for the people that are professionals, rather than being so prescriptive in law to say that it's going to be one way exactly.
And that is one of the things that the Teachers Association worked very hard to get clarified in the bill, that it would not be based solely on standardized tests.
And the CSAP presently does not measure all subject matter areas. And it's only grades, what, 3 through 10?
Uh-huh.
So there's new things to be developed.
And it does only reading, math, and then science in
And
ninth grade.
And writing.
And writing.
Writing.
So this governor's council has a huge job.
Uh-huh.
And then part of that must fall back on the district too. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
That's my interpretation of it. And given the resources, the scarce resources that we have dealt with in this district, it's a very interesting dilemma.
And that is, when I was at the state capitol talking to legislators about this bill, that was made very clear. You know, when I asked about how they came up with the dollar amount that they attached to the bill, they said, well, that will be the state's expense to monitor how the districts are doing. And I said, so that doesn't take into account the cost to the district of creating assessments or writing guidelines or finding the administrators, hiring administrators to do additional evaluations. And the answer to that was quite clearly no, it does not cover those costs.
Okay. Well, and how did they deal with that, Riley, at the legislature?
Well, we had multiple superintendents come and speak in support of the bill that said that this would not cost their school district 1 cent, that they're already working on things like this. And one piece that the bill does is it creates a resource bank where different districts can submit the types of assessments that they use that are wonderful and they feel are showing student growth and being very effective, and that can all be put into a centralized bank within the Colorado Department of Education. And then districts can go through and say, okay, I'm a 3rd grade arts teacher, an elementary arts teacher, and we don't have the time to be innovative and create this whole new examination. Is there something we can start from? Is there a comparable district that we can utilize the research and the resources that they've already done? And how can we work as a state to collaborate together and then modify it so that we're keeping that local control and looking at what's going to be most effective? So I think there's some different ideas about what the cost is going to be, and a lot of it is very, very speculative.
And then that gives us time to try to figure that out, and it would be especially good if we got the $175 million from Race to the Top.
And it's important to note that Colorado just earlier, I think it was this week, received a grant for $17.5 million. That's a state longitudinal data grant from the federal government that's to look at student growth and data systems and educator effectiveness. So that's going to help too, because it's going to help support these types of new systems.
Okay, and we don't know where that's going. It's going to the state, and whether it will filter out to the districts or if it will stay with this governor's council, maybe. Do you know?
The Race to the Top funds?
No, the money that Riley said they got.
That's the first time I've heard of it, so
okay.
I don't have an answer.
Also understand that Race to the Top money is only for 2 years. So, you know, where those funds will go for 2 years is anybody's guess. And then after that, the continuing cost of doing these evaluations and continuing to monitor assessments and everything else is going to be on the backs of the school districts.
And I'll share some of the administrators in the cabinet level, administrative assistant superintendents, somewhat like Monty did when he was here, have shared with me that to make this work, this bill work, we're going to need to hire more administrators.
Yes.
And that there's a cost to that.
Sure.
And that's an ongoing cost. So even if we get any of the grants we're talking about, Race to the Top, those funds come to an end after a short period of time, and yet we're going to continue to use this same system. And how are we going to fund then those administrators? I guess that's part of the question they've been concerned about that I've heard from higher level administrators in this district.
Yeah, well, that's certainly understandable because you have so many people to supervise, and then the principals also have motivation actually to have the best teachers, because I think 50% of their evaluation is also based on student outcomes.
And I thought that, can I just answer, deal with that? Because when I read that in the bill, I thought that's interesting that principals, in order to help them, they're going to want to have the best teachers. In order to help those teachers, are they going to want to have the best students? Does it trickle down that way? And that, to me, that's a possibility. That it could be, if you want to have the most effective growth, you want to have the most effective students, because they're the ones that have to take these assessments that we're all being judged upon.
Yes, but on the other hand, it crossed my mind at one point is that maybe you would want the poorest students because they're the ones that have the ability to
Make
really
the biggest
jump
growth
with great teachers and administrator.
And that's actually true. The statistics I think are fairly clear that sometimes when you get higher achieving students, they make less growth because they're already high achieving.
Right.
And I thought that was interesting. Then if it's based on now growth, would teachers want to have those high achieving students who are going to grow 1% instead of maybe if the goal is to grow 3%, then it's an interest. There's all kinds of nuance to this and a lot of unknowns.
But we've regressed into my growth should be higher than your growth, and it just says student growth.
Right. And so how that's defined is unknown. Absolutely
Yeah, so
right.
But that's the other reason why standardized assessments frequently don't work, both at the lower end and at the upper end. You know, I know my AP students have shown tremendous growth this year, but they all smashed the ceiling on standardized tests, both in the fall and right now. Mm-hmm. But their growth was according to my standards.
I'm wondering if I could ask
standards.
one question.
Sure, one more question.
Since we're kind of winding up. This bill is the law, so I was wondering if each of the panelists could give their hope for a positive outcome that could come from this bill as they interpret it.
Okay, that was my last question too. So you did it. Okay, why don't we start with Greg and just go down the line?
Sure. I like that. Best hopes. Talked about it somewhat already. Could I quickly just diverge a little bit and then get to that question? Because one of the thoughts
Sure.
that I had that I think is significant is kind of in my mind, a conundrum about this approach, in that we're looking at individual teachers and how we're measuring student outcomes, and then attaching a teacher's effectiveness to that student outcomes. And that's very individual. And we are in this district working on a system that wants schools to think of themselves as teams of teachers that work with all students. It's an interesting dilemma when you've got teachers who are supposed to work together and take ownership of all the kids' learning, and yet we pull out the individual teacher and attach that teacher's effectiveness to that student's growth. And I think that, to me, that's somewhat problematic. It's not best hope, by the way, but I'll get there.
But that's what the principal wants you to do, because then the whole school progresses, right?
Right, but then to identify this teacher was effective, and you can prove it based on this student's outcome, but we want this teacher to work with three other teachers, and that student's outcome may be connected to all three teachers equally, yet we pull it apart at the end for evaluation. It's a little bit of a problem in my mind. Best hopes is that this kind of high stakes pushes people together to work together in the best systems where there is an understanding. I think of myself when I was a principal that I believed that my best job as a principal would be to allow the teachers to help me to help them. They led the way. It wasn't me leading the way, it was them leading the way. But that was a risk I took, knowing that I wasn't in control of that. And my best hope is that that kind of system comes from this, so that there's a trust that develops where the teachers and principals recognize they're all together, working for the same goal, and there's support outside of that little system to help that work, and they're not being punished for being innovative and trying new things that maybe won't show particular growth, but they're trying to be innovative, and there's a safety net in there. So I'm hoping that continues to stay on, so that's my best hope with it.
Okay, Riley?
My biggest hope for this bill is that we're going to see a better educated Colorado, that we're going to see students just with higher graduation rates making strides. I think that there's the realistic aspect that, is this bill going to change everything in education in Colorado? No. Is it a great step forward? In my opinion, yes. And so I think that we can hope to see collaboration between students and teachers and administrators in schools, school districts, and across the state. And I think we can see some innovation and say, what can we do best for the kids in Colorado?
Okay, Mary?
Well, my best hope is a better education for every student in Colorado. And my other best hope is that this kind of dialogue continues across the state and really brings education to the forefront of discussions in Colorado at many, many levels. Right now, according to the best estimate, we are ranked 47th in the nation in educational funding, and according to the worst estimates, we have hit rock bottom at 50. And I hope that these kinds of discussions and the position that we can take, that we're working together to make this process work and to make it benefit kids, will open the doors to discussions about why we are funded so low and what opportunities might be available to our kids if we realize that that's not a position that's good for the kids in Colorado.
Okay, Monty?
A couple of things I think the bill will do that I'm excited about. First, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about principals, but I think they got lost in the shuffle.
Mm-hmm.
I think this will help principals be better instructional leaders. I think it'll help them focus on the instructional process, and that's where they should be instead of managers. I hope it'll help teachers have a set of standards that they focus on and that are consistent. I hope it'll be an improved process for dealing with ineffective teachers. And my biggest and most gigantic hope is that this is a collaborative process, and that the constituencies come out with ownership and pride, and it helps all the children and it helps the educational profession in the state of Colorado. Good
Okay.
luck to you all.
Hey, thanks.
Well,
Come on back
thank you.
and play with us.
I think we've done a very good job in covering this, the complexity of what Senate Bill 191 involves for everyone in education. We have to hope that the bill will produce well-educated students and well-prepared and effective teachers. It won't take effect fully until 2014-2015 school year, so that we will hear much more about the changes and challenges until then. This CrossCurrents program will be rebroadcast at various times during the month on Channel 14. Please check your local listings for exact times and dates. Copies of recent CrossCurrents programs are available for checkout at the Poudre River Library District at 201 Peterson Street and at the branch at Front Range Community College at Harmony and Shields. Thank you very much to our panel, to our studio audience, and to our viewing audience.